Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you.
Welcome to Pleasant Acres. The petunias stood at attention, each a perfect trumpet of pink, purple, or pristine white. Agnes Plumtree straightened, her gardening gloves stiff with peat moss, and surveyed her work. Not a single stray leaf marred the symmetry of the flower bed. Pleasant Acres demanded conformity, and Agnes was its most vigilant enforcer. The emerald lawns, the precisely pruned hedges, the identical mailboxes, all testament to the HOA's unwavering commitment to order. A faint, rhythmic whirring drifted from across the street. Agnes's brow furrowed. Robert Rodriguez's garage door was open again. She couldn't quite make out what was happening inside, but the muffled sounds of tinkering had been a near-constant presence the past few weeks. Agnes disapproved. Garages were for cars and meticulously organized storage, not whatever Robert was doing in there. She snipped a deadhead from a petunia with unnecessary force. Robert was a newcomer, and frankly, his integration into the community had been less than seamless. He hadn't embraced the weekly lawn mowing schedule with sufficient enthusiasm, for one thing, and his choice of outdoor furniture, vibrant, almost gaudy turquoise, clashed horribly with the muted earth tones preferred by the rest of the residents. Another car, a rusty sedan with mismatched hubcaps, pulled up outside Robert's house. A woman emerged, favoring her left leg as she limped towards the open garage. Agnes's eyes narrowed. This wasn't the first time she'd seen a stream of people, usually looking weary or injured, disappearing into Robert's garage. It was unsettling. Agnes pushed herself up from her kneeling position, her knees protesting with a chorus of pops. She brushed the dirt from her floral print gardening dress, a garment as meticulously ironed as her opinions. The garage door was tantalizingly ajar. She could almost see something. A flash of stainless steel, perhaps, or was it just the glint of sunlight on what? The woman who had limped inside emerged a half hour later. She was walking straighter, almost without a limp at all, and a small smile played on her lips as she got back into her car. Agnes watched, her suspicion deepening. What was going on in there? That evening, after a dinner of precisely portioned baked chicken and steamed broccoli, Agnes retreated to her meticulously organized home office. The walls were lined with shelves, each holding rows of alphabetically arranged books and perfectly aligned photo frames. On her mahogany desk lay the sacred text of Pleasant Acres, the HOA bylaws. She opened the thick binder, its pages dog-eared and underlined from countless readings. Section 4.3, Use of Residential Property, caught her eye. Agnes scanned the paragraph, her lips moving silently as she absorbed the legalese. Residential properties are to be used solely for residential purposes. Commercial activities, including but not limited to retail sales, service provision, and manufacturing, are strictly prohibited. A slow smile spread across Agnes's face. Robert's garage activities, whatever they were, certainly seemed to fall under the umbrella of service provision. And surely, operating a business from a residential garage was a clear violation of the bylaws. She flipped further, to Section 7.2, Nuisance and Disturbances. No resident shall engage in any activity that creates a nuisance or disturbance to other residents. The steady stream of cars, the muffled noises emanating from the garage, all disturbances, without a doubt. Agnes felt a surge of righteous indignation. Pleasant Acres was a haven of tranquility, a sanctuary from the chaos of the outside world. Robert's activities threatened that peace, undermined the very fabric of their community. Something had to be done. She reached for her telephone, its ivory finish gleaming under the soft lamplight. Her finger hovered over the speed dial button for the HOA. President, Mr. Abernathy. She hesitated for a moment. Perhaps she should gather more evidence first, solidify her case instead. She opened a new document on her computer. She titled it Rodriguez Violations, Pleasant Acres, and began to meticulously document every observation, every suspicion, every perceived infraction. The document quickly grew, fueled by her unwavering commitment to order and her growing unease about the mysterious happenings in Robert's garage. As she typed, a dull ache began to throb behind her left eye. Agnes ignored it, attributing it to the strain of concentration. She had a duty to protect Pleasant Acres, a responsibility to uphold its standards. The ache intensified, but Agnes pressed on, determined to expose Robert's transgressions and restore harmony to her beloved community. One meticulously documented violation at a time. The garage clinic. The air, thick with a clash of antiseptic and Mrs. Gable's overzealous popery, a floral assault meant to conquer the clinical, swirled around Doc Rodriguez. He gently probed Mrs. Gable's throbbing ankle, his touch a balm of practiced reassurance. Just a twist, Agnes, he rumbled, his voice a soothing counterpoint to the lingering disinfectant. Ice, elevate, brace, and give it a rest, all right? Agnes winced. Easier prescribed than done, Robert. Tuesday's bingo. He chuckled, offering a packet of ibuprofen. Bingo will survive, Agnes, your ankle, not so much. The garage, reborn as a clinic, spoke volumes of Robert's ingenuity. A weathered examination table, rescued from a closing medical supplier, anchored the space. Walls were lined with shelves, a pharmacy of donated medicines, stacked bandages. And the random, cheerful presence of children's books. Above, a faded anatomy chart, its corner peeling, served as a silent sentinel. He watched Agnes limp away, then kneaded the tension from his neck. The day's burdens were settling. A way familiar as his own heartbeat. A procession of sniffles, coughs, and complaints had marked the hours since dawn. His gaze drifted to the waiting area, two humble folding chairs currently hosting a young mother with a slumbering babe, and Maria Sanchez. Her face a canvas of worry. A tide of weariness crested, washing over him, a bone-deep ache. He closed his eyes, the sterile scent of the garage receding, replaced by the metallic tang of an emergency room in overdrive. Decades ago, he'd been tireless. A green doctor eager to heal the world's ills. He recalled those overflowing waiting rooms, the relentless flow of patients, the system straining under its own weight. Years spent immersed in a community where hardship and sickness were constant companions, where medical care was often a distant dream. Faces swam back, anxious mothers, weary fathers, children battling chronic conditions, all placing their trust in him. He'd witnessed it all, births, deaths, countless acts of healing. The experience had been exhausting, deeply gratifying, and ultimately profoundly affecting. He opened his eyes. This felt different, intimate, personal. Here, in his converted garage, he provided a thread of hope, a small act of kindness against the backdrop of an indifferent world. He beckoned Maria forward. Maria, come in, how's Miguel doing? Maria shuffled in, her shoulders slumped with concern. Not well, document the asthma's been terrible this week. He's been wheezing all night long. Robert guided her to the examination table, his movements deliberate and comforting. He listened to Miguel's chest, a slight furrow appearing between his brows. His airways are constricted, he confirmed. Are you using his inhaler as directed? Maria wrung her hands, her voice tight with worry. Yes, but it's almost empty. I don't know how I'll manage to afford another this month. Document rent is looming, and I've lost hours at the bakery. Robert retrieved an inhaler from a nearby cabinet. Here, he said, pressing it into her hand. This should ease his breathing. Don't fret about the cost, Maria, focus on getting Miguel well. Relief bloomed across Maria's features. Thank you, document, you're a true blessing. I don't know what we'd do without you. He offered a gentle smile. Just doing what I can, Maria. Make sure Miguel uses this correctly and bring him back if he doesn't improve, and try to relax. He's a resilient boy. Watching Maria depart, clutching the inhaler like a lifeline, Robert felt a surge of renewed purpose. He couldn't fix everything, but he offered a small measure of respite, a flicker of light in the shadows, and sometimes that was all it took. Bylaws and blood pressure. Agnes Plumtree hugged the HOA manual, its glossy surface reflecting the fading sunlight. Gravel crunched beneath her orthopedic shoes as she advanced on Robert Rodriguez's open garage. Propelled by a potent blend of indignation and caffeine. A medicinal reek drifted outward, a discordant note in the symphony of perfectly sculpted shrubs and pastel facades that defined Willow Creek Estates. Robert, she declared, her tone sharp with censure, a word, if you please. Robert, a furrow of worry etched on his face, was tending to a girl's abraded knee. He straightened, his dark gaze meeting Agnes with a composure that only inflamed her further. A stethoscope looped around his neck, and his lab coat, though pristine, bore a smudge that hinted at cherry-flavored syrup. Agnes, he greeted, his voice a calm resonance. Everything all right? All right? Hardly, Robert. This, clinic you're operating is a flagrant breach of regulations. She waved the binder. Section 4C2 explicitly prohibits commercial enterprises on residential property. And I'd scarcely consider dispensing medical aid to be a mere whim. Robert sighed, the sound taking some of the starch out of his bearing. Agnes, with respect, it's not a business that no one is charged for my services. He indicated the waiting area. an assortment of mismatched seating and a shaky card table. These folks need help, assistance they can't afford elsewhere. I'm just lending my skills. Noble sentiments, Robert, but benevolence doesn't trump bylaws. Imagine the precedent. If everyone decided to launch their own thing, where would we be? Anarchy? And the liability? Have you contemplated that? Disaster awaits. The little girl, now sporting a vibrant bandage, gazed up at Agnes, her eyes wide and uncertain. Robert offered a reassuring squeeze to her shoulder. We're cautious, Agnes, as a retired physician. I know best practices, and all is documented. He gestured to a well-used ledger nearby. Records maintained, nothing clandestine. Agnes' gaze narrowed, unconvinced. And the racket? The escalated traffic? 3 extra vehicles parked curbside this week, and yesterday's ambulance. This is a residential enclave. Robert, not a triage center. That was for Mrs. Gable's feline. Needed oxygen. And those extra vehicles are driven by neighbors volunteering their time. Robert's tone remained steady, though Agnes noted a glint of impatience. Martha provides refreshments. Tom handles the paperwork. We form a community. Agnes, supporting each other. Community, Agnes scoffed. This isn't community, Robert, it's lawlessness. And the potential biohazards? Proper medical waste disposal? Sanitation protocols observed? I highly doubt it. She advanced, her face flushed. The scent of the disinfectant, usually so neutral, now seemed invasive, a sharp reminder of the imagined offenses within the garage. Consider this your final warning, Robert. Cease this illicit operation now, or I will lodge a formal complaint. The HOA board will treat this with the utmost seriousness. Robert sustained her gaze, his expression inscrutable. The hum of cicadas filled the sudden vacuum between them. Agnes? He murmured, his voice softer now, almost beseeching. Think about your actions. Whom are you harming? Are rigid rules truly worth more than the health of your neighbors? Agnes' chest seized at a keen, strange discomfort stabbed behind her breastbone, stealing her breath. She clutched the binder, her knuckles bone-white. The world seemed to sway. She choked, her voice a bare exhalation. I don't feel well. Robert's eyes widened with concern. He reached out to support her, but Agnes flinched. Don't touch me, she rasped, her breathing shallow. Just leave me be. She spun and stumbled away, the HOA manual plummeting to the gravel with a muted sound. The pain intensified, a constricting vice threatening to suffocate her as she hastened toward her own immaculate, regulation-compliant abode. She detected Robert's voice calling after her. His words a muddled mix of worry and was that pity? She didn't need his pity. She needed order. She needed rules. And she needed this infernal pain to cease. Complaint filed. Agnes Plumtree pressed a hand against her breastbone. A nagging discomfort needling her, surely. It wasn't that. She dismissed the twinge with a flick of her wrist, attributing it to the sheer aggravation. That man was a one-man wrecking crew, dismantling the serenity of Willow Creek Estates. Back at the dining table, a chaotic sprawl of documents formed an obstacle course across its surface. HOA bylaws, downloaded county zoning regulations, printed screeds from Robert's website touting Dr. Robert's mobile wellness clinic, and a shockingly detailed, hand-rendered map of his garage, charting the dimensions of his examination space and the positioning of what she suspected were medical implements. The past 2 days had been consumed by compiling this indictment, each paper a stone in the fortress she was erecting against Robert's flagrant lawlessness. The aroma of lavender potpourri, normally a solace, now felt oppressive, almost sickeningly sweet. She revisited Section 3.2b of the HOA Charter, underlining it with a hand that betrayed her agitation. No commercial enterprise shall operate on residential properties if such activity generates undue noise, traffic congestion, or constitutes a disturbance to fellow residents. Disturbance? She spat, the word a satisfying burst of sound. The gall of parking his traveling infirmary right there for all to see at IT was practically a billboard for anarchy. With a final, resolute flourish, Agnes finalized the formal grievance that IT slipped into a pristine, white envelope, the address of Harold Jenkins, HOA president, rendered in elegant script, Justice, she hoped, was imminent. The following morning found Agnes on Harold Jenkins' porch at the stroke of 9. Harold, a devotee of khaki shorts and pastel polo shirts, greeted her with a tentative smile. "Agnes, morning," he offered, his voice a tad too buoyant, a touch too forced. "What brings you here?" Agnes presented the envelope as though it contained the Holy Grail. "I've lodged a formal complaint, Harold, against Robert Miller." Harold's smile wavered. He anticipated this. He'd observed the brewing conflict at the last HOA gathering, the glint in Agnes's eye whenever Robert was mentioned. "Oh," he murmured faintly, accepting the missive with a sigh disguised as a cough. "And the nature of this complaint, Agnes?" Agnes swept past him into the hallway, unbidden. "Zoning infractions, Harold. Unlicensed commercial operations, a brazen defiance of community standards. He's running a medical practice out of his garage." "Harold? A medical practice?" The final words punctuated with a dramatic intake of breath. Harold recoiled slightly. His fingers fiddling nervously at his collar, he ushered Agnes into the living room, indicating a chintz armchair. "Now, Agnes, let's not jump to conclusions. I'm certain there's a plausible explanation." He perched precariously on the sofa's edge, knees pressed tightly together. "Explanation? Harold, I possess photographic proof. I have archived his website. I have painstakingly documented the flow of patients in and out of his garage. He's even erected a sign. I witnessed it myself last evening, barely visible through the slats. It announced, 'Walk-ins welcome.'" Harold flinched. He knew Agnes's reputation for meticulousness, and a sense of foreboding settled upon him. He'd heard murmurs from other residents regarding the so-called clinic, some voicing apprehensions, others quietly confessing to seeking minor medical attention from the retired doctor. "Agnes," he began, striving for a measured tone, "I acknowledge your reservations, however. Fairness dictates we proceed cautiously. Robert's a relative newcomer. Perhaps he's simply unfamiliar with certain rules." "Unfamiliar?" Agnes scoffed. "He's perfectly aware, Harold. He's flaunting them. This is no innocent oversight. This is a calculated maneuver to destabilize our community's very foundation." She delved into her purse, extracting a small, amber vial. She uncapped it and swallowed a generous mouthful, her features twisting slightly. "What's that?" Harold inquired, genuine concern edging his voice. My heart medication," Agnes wheezed, clutching her chest once more. This entire ordeal is placing undue pressure on my system." Harold's face drained of color. The absolute last thing he wanted was a medical episode on his hands, particularly one directly tied to an HOA dispute that he knew he must tread lightly. "Agnes, I assure you, I will investigate this matter thoroughly. I will scrutinize the evidence and confer with Robert. Be assured, the HOA will enact appropriate measures should any violations be substantiated." Agnes narrowed her gaze, scrutinizing Harold's countenance. She recognized his inherent pliability, his susceptibility to influence, but she also knew his deep-seated regard for order and tranquility. "I expect swift action. Harold, this cannot be permitted to persist. The health, and indeed the very sanity, of this neighborhood demands it." She rose, her movements precise and unwavering. With that, Agnes Plumtree pivoted and strode from Harold Jenkins' residence, leaving the besieged HOA president to gaze after her, the weight of the white envelope, pregnant with the seeds of escalating discord, heavy in his grasp. The lingering scent of Agnes' lavender perfume hung in the air, a sharp reminder of the tempest gathering over Willow Creek Estate's warning shot. A tentative knock, barely a brush against the garage door frame, drew Robert's gaze. Harold Jenkins, HOA president, hovered there, shifting uncomfortably, his anxiety practically visible. Robert's makeshift examination space, a workbench reborn beneath sterile white sheets, seemed to shrink under Harold's gaze. "Robert, morning," Harold mumbled, eyes fixed on the concrete floor. A manila envelope, clutched tight, appeared to be his only source of courage. Robert offered a welcoming smile, immediately, sensing the storm brewing within Harold. "Harold, come in, please. What's on your mind?" He motioned toward a flimsy folding chair. Harold settled gingerly, the envelope crackling in his grip, a soundtrack to his inner turmoil. The board we convened. He swallowed hard, a bead of sweat catching the sunlight on his brow. Late morning heat amplified his distress. Robert waited patiently, a premonition settling in his stomach. Agnes. It invariably led back to Agnes. It's about, well, this operation you've got going, Harold finally confessed, gesturing vaguely. We've had concerns raised. Robert nodded slowly. Agnes, I presume? Harold flinched, wincing slightly. She's tenacious, Robert, as you well know. He raised his eyes, a silent plea for understanding etched in their depths. We value your work, truly that we know you're helping folks. But the bylaws, Robert, insurance, authorization, accountability. The HOA can't officially sanction. His voice trailed off, leaving the unspoken worries hanging in the air. Robert had deliberately sidestepped these hurdles, focused solely on immediate needs. Now, the chickens had come home to roost. Harold extended the envelope. This is a formal communication. From the board, we're asking you to cease these activities. Robert accepted the document, the stiff paper a world away from the worn tools hanging nearby. He didn't break the seal. He didn't need to. The directive was already etched into his understanding. I understand, Robert replied softly, a tinge of disappointment coloring his voice. Not anger, merely weariness. He had anticipated this. He'd simply hoped to avoid it. Harold visibly sagged, the tension easing from his posture. Look, Robert, this isn't personal. We need to adhere to protocol. Of course, Robert acknowledged, his gaze drifting to the small cache of pharmaceuticals, a collection of cast-offs and generics. What would become of Maria, dependent on those weekly blood pressure readings? Or young Carlos, whose lungs tightened with every shift in the barometric pressure? I'll honor the request, Robert affirmed, turning back to Harold. However, I won't forsake my patients. I'll simply need to be more circumspect. Harold's relief was almost palpable. That's a relief, Robert. Thank you. He rose quickly, eager to escape the unease. I should be going. Agnes is awaiting news. As Harold departed, Robert finally tore open the envelope. The letter echoed his expectations. A thicket of legal jargon and veiled intimidations. He tossed it onto the workbench. The cold formality a stark contrast to the heartfelt notes pinned to the wall, testaments of gratitude from those he served. The following day, Robert canceled appointments for the week ahead. He dedicated the morning to deconstructing the clinic, packing equipment into neatly marked containers. The examination table, transformed back into a workbench, once again a haven for tools and unfinished projects. The pharmacy shrank to a modest cabinet, barely noticeable. He contacted each patient individually, explaining the situation. The garage was off limits, at least in an official capacity. But he could still offer house calls, disguised as friendly visits. He could still provide guidance over the phone. Caution was now the watchword, heightened caution. That evening, Maria arrived, her face creased with worry. She required her regular blood pressure medication. Robert invited her inside for tea, steering her to the living room, well away from the inquisitive eyes of the HOA over conversation. He subtly provided her with the medicine she required, a silent affirmation between them. The clinic might be shut down, but Robert's dedication to his community remained unshaken. IT had merely retreated into the shadows, a hushed promise, a lifeline extended in secret. A warning had been issued, but it had only galvanized Robert's resolve that he would find a pathway that he always did, shadows and surveillance. Agnes's hand trembled, blurring the weak light slanting through the grimy panes of Robert Rodriguez's garage. She tweaked the focus, a triumphant murmur escaping her lips, vindicated, the dull pressure in her chest. Her constant companion of late, eased a fraction with each notation in her ledger. 7:14 p.m. Dark blue sedan. Plate obscured driver. Unknown. The sedan lingered for nearly 20 minutes. Agnes jotted furiously, sketching out scenarios involving illicit prescriptions, shadow medical practices, and blatant disregard for city ordinances. The pen's point nearly pierced the page with her fervor. The grandfather clock's steady cadence, a cold metronome in the hallway, seemed to count down to Rodriguez's inevitable exposure across town. In a cramped apartment, Maria Sanchez stared at the pharmacy receipt. The cost of Miguel's inhaler an ever-escalating mountain, she worried her lip, a familiar anxiety coiling in her gut. How could she possibly balance sustenance, shelter, and her son's very breath? The clinic, Dr. Rodriguez, he always managed to help. The prospect of its closure sent a chill through her. Where else could she go? The county hospital was a maze of red tape, and other clinics demanded some she couldn't dream of affording. Rodriguez's kind eyes, his calming manner, the way he patiently explained Miguel's condition in her native tongue. All irreplaceable treasures she rummaged, extracting a crumpled 5, smoothing it out against the denim of her worn jeans. It wouldn't even begin to cover a copay anywhere else. Back in Agnes's dim domain, the blue sedan finally departed. Agnes' gaze sharpened as Maria Sanchez emerged. The woman clutched a small bag to her person, her posture conveying what Agnes perceived as shame. Aha! She breathed, adding another entry. 7:34 p.m. Subject, identified as Maria Sanchez, exits Rodriguez residence, concealing package. Righteous fury surged, the gall. Using the garage as a covert dispensary, preying on the vulnerable like this Maria. The ache in her chest sharpened, a jabbing pain that stole her breath. Ignoring it, she focused on the drama unfolding below. Maria appeared anxious, her eyes flitting nervously as she hurried away. Agnes slammed the binoculars onto the sill, the noise causing Mrs. Higgins's cat to bolt from the fence and vanish into the shadows. Good. Let them all be unsettled. Let them all know they were being observed, that justice was on its way. She grabbed her phone, fingers clumsy with urgency. Time to notify the authorities. Time to expose this deception. Once and for all. But as she dialed, a dizzying wave crashed over her, and she gripped the table's edge for purchase. The room swam. The clock's ticking transformed into a deafening hammer against her skull. She gasped, unable to cry out, the phone slipping to the floor with a dull thud. The pain became an unbearable blaze, threatening to consume her. Stumbling towards the sofa, she clutched at her chest, her breath a shallow, ragged pant. The room's shadows lengthened and twisted, distorting the shapes in her carefully arranged space. Her meticulously constructed reality was fracturing, collapsing around her, and her last coherent thought was of Robert Rodriguez. He, somehow, was the architect of this destruction. To the pain. Agnes' deadhead petunias, each snip a small act of defiance. Her knees, burdened by age and arthritis, sent up muted protests as she crouched, plucking a withered lilac bloom. The late sun, filtering through the boughs of the oak, gilded the meticulously kept lawn. A minor victory, she thought. In the face of the encroaching wildness, even the HOA couldn't mandate perfection. A persistent tightness had gripped her chest since dawn, a pressure she habitually dismissed. The Robert imbroglio was reaching fever pitch, and her body always registered strain in this way. She'd brewed an extra measure of chamomile, inhaled deeply, and carried on. The community's standards demanded vigilance. She wouldn't falter. Abruptly, a savage spike of agony stabbed through her core, an unprecedented violation. She cried out, the shears clattering onto the flagstones of the small patio. Her vision blurred, the vivid hues of her prize-winning flowerbed dissolving into an indistinct swirl. Sweet heavens? She gasped, clutching at her middle. The torment intensified, branching out like tendrils of poison ivy. Attempting to rise, her legs betrayed her, and she collapsed onto the closely cropped turf. The world lurched sickeningly overhead. The sky stretched, a vast and uncaring azure canvas. She strained to shout, to summon assistance, but only a raspy sound escaped her throat, thick and constricted. Help! She rasped, the plea lost amidst the whispering canopy above. No one appeared. Only the steady hum of a lawnmower from a distance. A mundane serenade oblivious to her torment filled the air. She remained there. The unrelenting sun beating down her usually astute mind began to unravel. Fleeting memories surfaced. Agnes, ramrod straight before a packed community hall, her voice resonating with indignation as she condemned Robert's unlicensed healing. Agnes, meticulously cataloging every perceived transgression, each vehicle parked beyond its allotted time, every wayward weed daring to encroach on a neighbor's verdant expanse. Agnes, composing precisely calibrated missives to the HOA board, each sentence honed to a fine edge of polite aggression. Agnes, ever watchful, ever in command now. She lay prostrate on her manicured estate, a cast-off doll. She recalled volunteering at a soup kitchen years ago, doling out nourishment to the needy. A transient feeling of purpose had flickered within her, quickly extinguished by the unease of associating with such people. They lacked finesse. They defied predictability. Another wave of excruciating pain crashed over her, robbing her of breath. She squeezed her eyes shut, tears escaping. The pain was all-consuming, threatening to dismantle the tightly wound order of her being. She thought of Arthur, her late husband. He'd often chided her for excessive worry. Urging her to unwind, she'd scoffed. Naturally, relax. With societal norms eroding, someone had to uphold standards. Someone had to be resolute. Now, prostrate in her sanctuary, Agnes grasped that she'd invested so much energy in upholding those standards that she'd lost sight of their value. The pain persisted, an unyielding force. She was fading, the boundaries of her perception dissolving. The flawless lawn undulated before her eyes, morphing into an expansive, indifferent emerald sea. The sun, so radiant moments before, dwindled into a remote, dying ember. She attempted another cry, a final, desperate entreaty. But her voice had vanished, swallowed by the encroaching shadows. Silence descended. Only the rustling leaves, murmuring secrets she no longer had the strength to understand. The pain. A second chance. The air felt suffocating, a heavy blanket woven with pre-storm moisture that made Maria's clothes cling uncomfortably as she hurried down the street, eye in her pocket. The wadded $5 bill felt like a lead weight. The paltry sum she could spare for Miguel's dwindling inhaler supply. A familiar wave of humiliation washed over her. Robert's kindness was a lifeline, but even his deeply discounted prices felt impossibly out of reach these days. She turned onto Agnes Plumtree's meticulously sculpted lawn to find the older woman sprawled amidst the vibrant petunias, her complexion ashen, her face twisted in agony. A sharp, involuntary sound tore from Maria's throat. "Senora Plumtree!" She darted forward, kneeling. Agnes's breaths were shallow and ragged, one hand clutching her lower abdomen as a guttural moan escaped her. Maria knew this tableau. She'd witnessed a similar crisis long ago, with her beloved abuela. "Duele aquí?" she asked, gently probing Agnes's lower right side. Agnes recoiled, a piercing cry punctuating the stillness. Appendicitis, a ticking clock, forget the shame, the meager sum in her pocket. Agnes needed intervention, and now. "Ayudame, por favor." Maria strained, grappling with the woman's weight. "I need to get you to Doc Rodriguez." She managed to maneuver Agnes, half dragging, half carrying her toward her own house. Then, fueled by a sudden surge of adrenaline, she nearly hauled her the remaining distance to Robert's garage. The sharp tang of motor oil mingled with the antiseptic scent of disinfectant as she stumbled into the waiting area. Robert, spectacles perched precariously on his nose, glanced up from a well-worn medical text. His expression shifted instantly to concern as he registered the situation. "Maria? What's happened?" "It's Senora Plumtree. I found her in her yard. I think it's her appendix." Maria's voice was a breathless rush. "She's in terrible pain." Robert's demeanor transformed. He became a whirlwind of focused action. Gently, with practiced ease, he helped Agnes onto the examination table, his touch, a study in reassurance. As he palpated her abdomen, Agnes whimpered, her face glistening with perspiration. Robert's brow creased in a deep furrow. "She's right. Rebound tenderness, guarding textbook appendicitis." He snatched the phone. "Maria, can you monitor her? Just ensure she's still breathing adequately." He rattled off quick instructions: respiration rate, pulse check. Despite the mounting fear, Maria followed his directions with laser-like focus. Robert was already on the phone, his voice calm but firm. "Dr. Rodriguez here. I have a patient exhibiting classic signs of acute appendicitis. Immediate surgery is crucial. Plumtree, Agnes Plumtree. The address is..." He provided Maria's address and precise directions, his voice betraying none of the urgency he must have felt. He detailed Agnes's condition in precise medical terms that were only marginally comprehensible to Maria. He hung up, his expression softening as he turned back to Agnes. "The ambulance is en route. Just try to breathe deeply. Senora Plumtree. We're doing everything we can. Agnes's eyelids fluttered. Rodriguez? She rasped, her voice a mere thread. Your practice. Robert offered a gentle, reassuring smile. Concentrate on breathing, Senora Plumtree. We can debate my practice later. Sirens pierced the air, escalating with each heartbeat. A wave of overwhelming relief threatened to buckle Maria's knees. She had acted. She had been useful. Paramedics swarmed in, their faces etched with professional seriousness. They swiftly transferred Agnes to a gurney and whisked her away, the siren's wail diminishing into the distance. Robert turned to Maria, his eyes filled with genuine gratitude. You did brilliantly, Maria. You recognized the symptoms. You likely saved her life. Hours later, Maria, a knot of anxiety in her stomach, sat in the hospital's sterile waiting area. Robert remained by her side, a silent pillar of support until last. A doctor appeared, fatigue etched on his face. Mrs. Plumtree is out of surgery. It was a near thing. Her appendix had ruptured any delay and... He shook his head grimly. She's in recovery now. She'll recover, thanks to the prompt action of whoever got her here so quickly. Maria and Robert exchanged a glance. Maria knew Robert would deflect the praise. It was nothing, Maria demurred, her voice barely a whisper. But deep inside, a tiny bud of self-worth began to unfurl at a change of heart. The heart monitor emitted a measured beep, a metronomic reminder of Agnes Plumtree's precarious grip on life, echoing in the stark, clinical space. Above, the fluorescent lights hummed, a jarring chorus that grated on her already frayed nerves. Each twinge in her abdomen served as a brutal testament to her near miss, and with each throb came a wave of mortifying regret. She'd recoiled at the thought of Doc Rodriguez's touch, a man operating out of a makeshift clinic, utilizing unconventional tools. The whole affair felt tainted, perilous. Yet, his swift intervention, his unwavering focus, had snatched her from the jaws of... She refused to dwell on the alternative. Maria Sanchez's image surfaced. The woman's averted gaze when Agnes had interrogated her about the clinic. Agnes had interpreted it as shame, embarrassment at requiring charity. Now, humbled and stripped of her preconceived notions, she recognized something else. Gratitude tinged with apprehension. The fear of losing the soul. Resource available when her son's asthma flared. Harold Jenkins had visibly squirmed as he delivered the cease and desist order to Dr. Rodriguez. She recalled how Harold's collar seemed to constrict him, his usual bravado replaced by a hesitant stutter. He hadn't relished the task. Likely none of them had. They were simply adhering to protocol. Agnes had always championed it. The bedrock of a functioning society, the shield against societal unraveling. But what could be more anarchic than condemning someone to death for the sake of pristine lawns? Her hospital release felt like a rebirth, fragility mingled with unwavering conviction. Her first act wasn't returning to her pristine estate, but driving straight to Robert's garage. Sunlight streamed through the open door, illuminating the familiar array of medical implements. Robert was hunched over a young boy, meticulously tending to a scraped knee. Maria Sanchez stood close by, her face a canvas of relief. Agnes faltered, her throat suddenly parched. She'd formulated countless apologies in her mind. But now, confronted with the reality, the words seemed paltry. Robert glanced up, his expression an inscrutable mask. Dr. Rodriguez. She began, her voice a tremulous whisper. I owe you an apology. An immeasurable one. Robert straightened, setting down the bandage. Mrs. Plumtree. I'm relieved to see you're recuperating. His tone was even devoid of accusation. Recuperating because of you, Agnes countered. I was wrong. Utterly wrong. About you, about your clinic, about everything. She gestured feebly. I saw desperation, and I condemned it. I encountered compassion, and I sought to extinguish it. I am thoroughly ashamed. Maria Sanchez stepped forward, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. He helped my Miguel when the hospital turned us away. No insurance, you understand. Dr. Robert, he always helps. Agnes turned to Maria, her heart aching with newfound empathy. I understand now. I truly do. The subsequent HOA meeting was overflowing with attendees. Agnes, still pale but radiating newfound resolve, addressed her neighbors from the front. Harold Jenkins fidgeted uncomfortably in his chair. "I convene this assembly," she announced, her voice resonant and unwavering, "to discuss the situation regarding Dr. Rodriguez's clinic." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. "I was mistaken," she reiterated, her gaze encompassing the faces before her. "I was so preoccupied with property values and regulations that I lost sight of what truly matters: our community. Our neighbors. Dr. Rodriguez isn't running a commercial enterprise. He's providing an indispensable service. He saved my life, and he's assisting countless others with no other recourse." She recounted her ordeal, her voice cracking with emotion as she detailed Maria Sanchez's plight. She extolled Robert's dedication, his empathy, his unwavering commitment to those in need. "We cannot forsake this," she concluded. "We cannot allow fear and prejudice to dictate our actions. I propose that we, as an HOA, not only revoke the cease and desist order but actively champion Dr. Rodriguez's endeavors. Let us transform Pleasant Acres from a bastion of rigid rules into a sanctuary of compassion, a community that nurtures its own." The ensuing silence was palpable, charged with expectation. Then, slowly, hesitantly, applause began to spread through the room like a wave. Harold Jenkins was the first to rise, followed by others, until the entire room was standing, applauding and cheering. Pleasant Acres didn't achieve utopia instantly. Deep-seated prejudices are tenacious. But a seed had been sown, a burgeoning understanding had taken root. The garage clinic was no longer just a garage. It was a symbol of hope, of empathy, of a community finally prepared to transcend its manicured facades and acknowledge the genuine needs of its neighbors. Agnes Plumtree, the woman who had once sought to shutter it, now stood at the vanguard, a transformed individual, determined to cultivate the delicate tendrils of kindness that were beginning to unfurl.